I've been watching the Brendan Banfield murder trial here on WUSA 9+. You've been streaming it live with us, and we appreciate you for being here with us. A lot has happened. I'm Katie Lelso. This is Frank Salvedo, a criminal defense attorney in Virginia. He's joining us to give us some analysis of what we have seen unfold. If you do have questions for Frank, you can text us at 202-895-5599. Again, that number to text is 202-895-5599. All right, let's briefly talk about what just happened. Brendan testified all day long, and then about the last 30 minutes or so, we had Nick Barrera, an audio-visual technician, forensic analyst, take the stand. I do really want to talk about that before we go back to Brendan Banfield. And it seemed as though he was comparing audio, and that was audio of the 911 call, the first 911 call that was made at 7:47 in the morning of February 24th, 2023, in which you hear this moaning sound and then the call hangs up. We know that the next call is made about 15 minutes later at 8:02 a.m. and that is the call where we hear both Juliana Peres Magalhães and Brendan Banfield telling the 911 operator what has unfolded. But in that first call, we hear this moaning sound, and the thought was that that moaning sound was Joseph Ryan. We are not going to play that audio for you because it is disturbing and it's upsetting for the family of Joseph Ryan. Now, Juliana Peres Magalhães testified that that was Joseph Ryan moaning in the background, but today we have this witness up on the stand talking about how he believes that moaning is the Banfield's dog. That dog's name is Lily. What was the point of that?
I think the point of that was just to poke another hole in Juliana's testimony. It was something concrete in the defense's view that they could put forward to poke one more hole in her testimony and then wrap up their case. The case is essentially done now. Prosecution looks like they have about 10 or 15 minutes left of testimony. Then they're going to go into some very ponderous jury instruction conference, and then it looks like closing arguments will be tomorrow at 10. But this trial is essentially over. The point is, they poked a little bit of a hole in her testimony. I think it's pretty amazing in a way that there is an expert that makes a living on looking at things like this, and he provided some decent testimony. Was it earth-shattering? No. Was it a little bump in the road? Yes.
It just pokes another question, another potential hole. And I think it's interesting that, it was Juliana Peres Magalhães' attorney who recorded audio of the dog moaning or groaning. And Juliana, that audio and this testimony goes against what Juliana said. Why are they able to access what evidence was collected by Juliana's attorney?
Yeah, it looks like at some point they meaning the attorneys for Juliana and Mr. Banfield, were in accord in terms of how they were going to approach this case. Perhaps Mr. Banfield was even going to testify for Juliana. So at one point there was some cooperation. Obviously no longer, because Juliana has now turned on Mr. Banfield and provided this testimony. Her attorneys got her this really nice deal in the case. So yes, I think at some point they cooperated with each other, and this recording of the now infamous Lily was turned over and is now a little part of this case. If not a key part, a little part of it.
Do you think it's an important part, though? Do you think that jurors are walking away with that and wondering if Juliana lied? Like, what are they thinking walking away with that information?
You never know. Likely, I think looking at it, stepping aside from it a little bit, I don't think it's going to win the day, so to speak. But again, it is a little piece, and a juror could be saying, the jury's going to be back there perhaps arguing about this case. So each attorney is trying to provide ammunition for that argument, because long after the closings are done, let's say it's the second or third day of deliberation, if you're sticking to a position and perhaps you're in the minority, you want facts or something to go back to stick up for your position. And maybe a juror goes back there and says, you know what, we know she lied about the dog, we know she lied about the moaning, and that is something concrete that a juror during the length of deliberations can hold on to. The emotion, the crying, all of that stuff, it kind of goes away when you're really in the depth of those conversations in that jury room. There are facts that you want to go back to support your position, especially if you're in the minority. So I think that was an effort by the defense to create one of those argumentative facts that a juror could go back to.
All right, so just poking more questions. Let's talk a little bit about what's going to be happening the rest of the day. Obviously, the defense has officially rested their case. So what is going to be happening next is the prosecution will be calling their rebuttal witnesses. And we heard prosecutor Juliana Sands say that she has 2 witnesses to call. She said one will take 10 minutes, the other will take 5 minutes. I'm very curious to see who these 2 rebuttal witnesses are. She has already asked the judge if she could bring on a surprise witness, if you will, someone she says reached out to the Commonwealth after listening to Brendan Banfield's testimony yesterday, said, hey, I have information that contradicts what he's saying. I'm not quite clear if the judge said you're good to go on that witness. Did you get an understanding of that?
Unclear. It looks like to me that perhaps the judge has put the kibosh on that. Can't really say for sure.
Okay.
Obviously, this witness has seen some of the testimony, and typically, as we talked about in the very, very beginning, there's a rule on witnesses where you don't want witnesses sitting in the courtroom watching other witnesses and then tailoring your own testimony to deal with what you saw. So I'm sure Mr. Carroll said, wait a second, this is a violation of the rule on witnesses. Apparently this person has been watching Mr. Banfield and is going to come in and say something to contradict him. We don't quite know what the parameters are and whether the judge has agreed with that or not. I expect this next 15 minutes of testimony to be very brief. I think Mr. Carroll will probably have some brief cross-examination, but this case is wrapped up. I think the rebuttal witnesses will probably just pick apart a certain portion of Mr. Banfield's testimony is kind of the vibe that I'm getting from the prosecutor. I don't think they're calling rebuttal witnesses to deal with the forensic stuff or anything like that. They're not going to call their own expert, which I'm sure the defense will point out in closing statement. It's probably just a little bit of evidence, much like the dog testimony, to just pick apart a little bit of what Mr. Banfield told the jury.
Yeah, and we do have people in the comments talking about how they're actually in the courtroom watching this and then stepping out in the breaks to tune in to what you're saying, Frank. So thank you so much for everyone who's been on here and sending us questions. And speaking of those questions, let's get to a few. We've had a ton coming in. So let's get to this first one. People are asking, when do you think the jury will come to a decision? We now know that the judge said that the plan is to have jury instructions today and then closing arguments starting at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. A reminder, there will be court tomorrow. So closing arguments would be tomorrow, and then does it immediately go into the hands of the jury after that?
I think the way it will work is that, again, the prosecution goes first. Sometimes they give a real short closing, then the defense goes, and then the prosecution can go again. And sometimes the strategy, particularly in Fairfax, has been to give a short closing if you're the prosecutor, wait for the defense to make their points, and then you make a longer closing. The court will generally instruct beforehand, so the court will read probably about 25 to 30 minutes of instructions. That's when we'll see whether there's any lesser included offenses involved, whether she gives a manslaughter instruction or anything like that as an option to the jury. Then the parties go ahead and make their closings. I'm thinking it all finishes by the lunch break, all the arguments. Then I think she will send them to lunch from 1 to 2-ish. All the exhibits will be put together. Because remember, the clerk, God bless the clerk, will have to gather all the exhibits, and then that'll be taken into the jury room. So juror deliberation probably starts around 2 o'clock tomorrow. It's a Friday. They have to leave by 5:30. Unless they're all in agreement that he's guilty or not guilty, we're looking at a Monday or Tuesday verdict.
But we could potentially see a verdict as early as tomorrow, you think?
Absolutely.
Wow, that would be very quick. And we're 3 weeks into this trial. It was slated to potentially go 4 weeks. We were off to a fast start. It really slowed down Friday and into this week a little bit, but wow, really closing out pretty quickly. All right, let's get to another question. Again, if you have questions for Frank, 202-895-5599 is the number to call. Okay, so somebody asked, can the prosecutor call rebuttal witnesses after defense counsel does its redirect? Is that likely? We know that that is actually going to happen. 2 witnesses, according to Juliana Sands, are who she is going to call. Somebody else asked, where are the people to corroborate this testimony on her affairs? It's just not believable. So they're talking about the affairs that Brendan Banfield testified that he alleges that Christine Banfield was happening. Obviously, she's not here to defend herself. Is that a situation where they need to have somebody kind of confirm that? I did hear a few objections during that. about hearsay?
It would be certainly beneficial for the defense if they were able to acquire a witness that would corroborate that testimony. Two schools of thought: either there is no such witness because there was no affair, or there is a witness who's on a dating site who we have no idea, perhaps didn't even use their own name. Who knows where that person is? They could have been unreachable. Maybe they did have a name and they just couldn't run that person down. In Virginia, it's very difficult, or it can be somewhat difficult to subpoena out-of-state witnesses. That person could be overseas, who knows, or that person could not exist if you believe the Commonwealth's theory.
Yeah, and I think it also begs the question of, we heard Brendan testifying that Christine allegedly had a BDSM relationship in New York. The point of bringing that up, he could have found that person. No, it seems like he was pretty in the know about who that person was. Is it just they don't need to prove that?
I think, again, it could have been one of two circumstances. It seems like the prosecutor kind of opened the door to that testimony. If you recall, during his direct testimony, the prosecution kind of was able to keep out that allegation about a prior relationship along those lines. But Mr. Carroll was able to get up on redirect and say, wait a second, you were asked about this during cross, so now I'm allowed to bring it in. The judge kept it very limited, but either that person exists or doesn't exist. It's out there now in the universe. We'll see if the jury thinks that that was just a home run effort by Mr. Banfield to try to create something that isn't there, or whether it was something consistent with what happened here.
Interesting. All right, so somebody asked, was it beneficial for the prosecution to try them in the same trial versus separate trials? I'm not quite sure what they mean. I guess they're saying because she's testifying, she's getting this plea agreement. Do you think it would have been beneficial to try them together, or?
Virginia has some different rules on what's called severance.
Okay.
So there's two types of severance. You can be tried if we commit a robbery together. In Virginia, it's a lot easier for the defense to kind of separate us and have two independent trials.
Right.
The idea being the evidence against you may be more prejudicial against me, and vice versa. So there's severance of people. There's also severance of charges, where the defense can sometimes say, or the prosecution can say, charges should be brought separately in order to make sure that the person gets a fair trial on each charge. Federal court, everybody is charged together. That is the big advantage that federal prosecutors have, is they can bring everybody together, and it loosens the rules of evidence. In state court, it's very hard to try people together. Getting a little bit easier, but traditionally it's been very hard to try them together. I don't think in this case they would have been tried together. I think they would have been tried separately. But I don't know if Mr. Banfield would have been tried at all, but for the deal that Juliana got to testify against him.
And it's a good time to remind people that Brendan was arrested in September of 2024. Juliana was arrested in October of 2023. So let's start at the beginning, right? Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan, they're killed in February of 2023. In October of 2023 is when Juliana Peres Magalhães is arrested. It's not until September of the following year, so September of 2024, that Brendan Banfield is arrested. And then it's not until October of 2024 that we see Juliana take that plea deal. So the police officers that have testified said they had enough evidence to press charges against Mr. Banfield. They said it was blood evidence, forensics evidence, but we've really seen them heavily weigh on Juliana's testimony. So yeah, I'm curious, if Juliana hadn't agreed to testify, what would have happened there? How would they have been able to go through a trial?
Well, no matter what the authorities might say, the proof is always in the pudding, right? So charges were not brought until it was a situation where they needed Juliana. They needed Juliana in this trial. I think probably if the closing statements or arguments are 2 hours long, I would hazard a guess that an hour of those 2 hours is going to be devoted to Juliana. She's a key point in this whole case. She gives life to everything. She gives life to the forensics. She gives life to the blood spatter evidence. She gives life to the 911 call. She's the one that gives life to the prosecutor's case. Is there enough bad facts to convict him outside of her testimony? Perhaps. but she's the one that really gives life to all of the data, all the raw evidence.
All right, I do have one last question. Well, I have two questions for you, one from a viewer, and then I have one last question for you before we take you back in the courtroom, which should be happening in the next 2 minutes or so for the final witnesses, if you will. The first question is one we have heard over and over again. People still asking about Juliana. We know she has this plea agreement. Can that plea agreement deal, the deal of her getting time served and then being sent back to Brazil, what is the likelihood of that deal being challenged, the judge deciding otherwise? I know we have our plea agreement here, and it does say that it is at the discretion of the judge in this case, which you said would be Judge Oscarati, right?
Yeah, I mean, the agreement certainly sets out that it is within the court's discretion as to what happens here. I think it's highly unlikely that this judge or any judge deviates from this agreement.
Right.
The next time myself or one of my colleagues represents a cooperating witness and the prosecutor says, I tell you what, we're going to do this deal and we're going to give this deal to your client, maybe it's we're going to give that person 5 years instead of 15 years, I will stand up and say, well, wait a second, you had a prior deal where this person didn't get the recommendation that you guys wanted. So I would think that the judge is going to follow this recommendation, not knowing anything about the prior conversations. Typically speaking, the judge follows the recommendation, so I think it's highly unlikely that she gets something other than the recommended sentence.
All right, my last question for you, as I do expect them to start up momentarily. You know, last night before you left, I said to you, how do you think Brendan Banfield did on his first day of testimony? And you said C-, a strong C-. You watched the rest of his testimony today. What grade would you give him overall for his testimony?
Better today,
Okay.
I thought, than he was yesterday. But yesterday he had some minefields that he had to get through. You know, I think he's in the B range. Is the B range what he needed to be? But he certainly picked it up from yesterday. I think he got more comfortable. He was even asking the judge a question, or he wanted to. So he seemed more comfortable. I think he also scored some points on his direct. And I think a little bit during the cross-examination. Jenna Sands was punchy, but she wasn't incredibly expansive in her cross. So I'm left with kind of a B, but under these lights, under this pressure, you know, is a B enough to create reasonable doubt? It could be. I wish I was there watching in the courtroom. I could probably give you a little bit better answer.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of, you know, feedback from people who are in the courtroom once we check in with Matthew Torres. Frank will be here with us tomorrow after closing arguments, so make sure you're back with us. In the meantime, we do want to get you back in the courtroom. It looks like the judge is addressing.